Hello everyone, welcome to my channel about writing stuff. My name's Camille and today we are going to talk about how to decide how many point of view characters you need for your story. Now, I like to think about this sort of idea of point of view characters for your story in three different sections. So the first one is you have like a single POV character. And that usually involves a lot of internal struggle or maybe like familial relationships. A single character story has a lot to do with their life as a whole, how they got to where they are, what they want, where they're going. And it's very much an internal plot combined with the external plot. Then we have the dual perspective point of view story, which is extremely common in like a relationship story or in a romance. This dual perspective thing is very important for a relationship story because you have the sort of internal conflict, the observational aspect of it. You have character A sort of observing and interpreting the things going on with character B that could be true or false, and then we have character B doing the same thing. So there is this constant disconnect as you go back and forth between what is actually happening inside the character's head and what the opposite character is perceiving. It's a very powerful for like a romance. And then we have the third and final option, which is the multiple POV story. And this is usually, an epic. This is an adventure story. This is the large scope sort of idea. And there's really like two offshoots of this. The first one is like the Eye of the World long series by Robert Jordan, which is, you have a band of people go off on an adventure and they split up. It's the same thing with Lord of the Rings. You have just you have a group of people, one POV character, they go out into the world, split up, and then the point of view jumps to these different separated groups. And then you have more of the Song of Ice and Fire, where you have people in different parts of the world at the very beginning of the story, and then they all come together in interesting and odd ways. Now, you need to figure out first what your story is. Is it a story about a person, about a single person, their internal plot and how it relates to the external plot? Is it a relationship story where you have two characters and you need to go back and forth? Or is it this sort of epic tale? And there's also this other offshoot kind of idea. This is something that I'm currently playing with, so I really don't have a handle on it, but let's say you want to write sort of this internal struggle story paired with like suspense. Then you can include sort of this multiple POV thing where you have, your character A protagonist, you have a character B protagonist, and then you have a character C antagonist, where like the reader is aware who the bad guy is, but the protagonists don't know who the character is. So instead of it being like a mystery, it is a suspense story, because as the reader, you are dreading what will happen when the protagonist finds out who the antagonist is and finds out what their intentions are and what they're really doing. But anyway, so you need to figure out what your story is, number one. Number two, you really need to get a handle on, is this a standalone story? Is this one book, or will it be a series? Let's say that you want to write this internal struggle story with the external plot. So you want this first book to have a single main character. You want the reader to be in one character's head. But in future books, you want to do multiple points of view. You want to jump around to different characters, to their different stories, to their different relationships. This is common in YA sort of stuff, like YA fantasy books. It's common. But it's this idea of, book one, we're in one character's head, but then we want to jump around to other characters in future books. So then that can tell you that you want to end up having multiple POVs later on, but for now you should start with a third person narration instead of a first person, because that would make the transition easier. Let's see. And you really want to make this sort of thing natural when it comes to point of view shifts. I love Robert Jordan's series because he does this very well. It is, it ends up being like a 14-book series, like a 15-book series with like a prelude. And it's just this massive story. But the whole like first half of the first book is from Rand's point of view. We are introduced to the two rivers, the little town. We're introduced to all of these characters, their customs, and then sort of like the fairy tale boogeyman, the dragon. And then this band of characters go off into this big wide world. And then by the time we get point of view breaks, we already know the other characters whose points of view we're jumping into. And readers don't think like writers. That is something that writers struggle with, is we have the mindset to read critically and to really see the frame of what an author is doing in their writing, but readers aren't like that. Readers go into the book for the story, to enjoy the story. So if you make these point of view shifts natural, if the reader already knows the character whose head they're jumping into, it feels natural and it makes the story flow better. Now with the George R. R. Martin style 8 point of view characters at the very beginning of the first book, I, like everyone else, I would not recommend that if it's, your first or second book. But it really comes down to knowing what your story is and what your story needs. If you are writing this epic where you have people all across the globe because you have just a fantastic ending in mind for when you bring these characters all together, then by all means, go for it. But if you are just sort of like pantsing or discovery writing an epic fantasy with multiple people in multiple different places, what usually happens is writers do this sort of thing to show off the world that they've created, or to show off the cultures they've created, to show off the characters they've created. And it doesn't read like a cohesive story, especially if you are a discovery writer, because if you don't know what you're writing towards, then it's just a bunch of filler scenes, and you would probably need a big overhaul. So I wouldn't recommend that. And another thing too is there are some great epic tales with a first-person narrator. I've mentioned all these books before, so I'm not going to mention them again, but you can have an epic fantasy tale told from one person's point of view, but the thing that these sort of stories have in common is there is a lot of internal struggle. There's a lot of internal plot. We get a lot of, what the character wants. We get some like brooding on the past and things like this. So, yeah. So, for example, the last book that I wrote, I really didn't know how I wanted to shape this story. I didn't really know what it was, but let's see. I sort of debated. So I had like my main protagonist, and then I sort of debated having a point of view character, having one of the antagonists as a point of view character. And I kind of played around with this idea, but it wasn't working. And the reason why it wasn't working is because if the reader knew who the antagonist was in this story, then it completely destroyed and dismantled my external plot, which was a mystery. The story that I wrote was a contemporary fantasy. The internal plot for my character is that she's a foster kid and she wants to make her real family of foster siblings kind of whole. And then the external plot was this mystery. Who is her sister gets kidnapped, and she needs to like find out who it is, who took her, why. So that's the mystery. So if I had included the antagonist as a point of view character that would have ruined the mystery for the reader, and it would have completely ruined my external plot, which would have changed my mystery story literally into just like a brooding internal struggle, and it would have made my main character seem like an idiot, basically. And then the book that I'm writing now, I was having trouble. I wanted to have 3 characters, all of which are morally gray, but I wanted one to be geared more towards an antagonist, like purposefully working against both of my main protagonists. But I didn't want it to be a mystery. It's a historical fantasy with like some supernatural elements, more magical elements, really. But I didn't want it to be a mystery. I wanted the reader to know what was going on because I wanted to instill this sense of dread in the reader. I wanted the reader to be lightweight freaking out about what would happen when everyone's secrets and the truth of what's going on came to light. So I decided to make all of these characters point of view characters, third person point of view for my 2 protagonists and my antagonist. Also because they're all morally gray and because they all have genuinely sound reasons for doing the bad things that they do. So instead of making this story a mystery, I made it, an internal struggle plot with a like suspense plot, I guess. So yeah, it's figuring out how to point of view characters really comes down to knowing what your story is and what it needs and what you want this story to invoke in the reader. What do you want the reader to be feeling as they are in the pages? So yeah, that's pretty much all I have for you guys this week. I suck. I do not have resources. I've not had resources for a while. I need to think of some resources. Anyways, I'll see you guys next week to talk about something else. But for now, as always, you should be writing stuff.